Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 27th, 2023, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's show, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible, especially now around the holidays when things get tight. I really appreciate your kind of unwavering support of the show. Remember, the model of the show is that I do not charge for episodes. I periodically sell ads to try and make a little bit of money. That is not the dominant source of the income that offsets the expense of making the show. Obviously, I have to pay an editor. I pay my assistant to do a lot of the booking and the back end work on the show, and of course, my own time as well. And so the way that we make this possible is through that kind of user experience model, just like you see here in the US, at least on like NPR and PBS. We use Patreon as our platform. And if you're interested in pledging your support, you can visit patreon.com/talknerdy, and you can pledge on an episodic basis as much or as little as you like. That offsets it so that individuals who can't afford to do so still have access to every single episode. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. All right, let's dive into the show. So I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Jane Gregory. She is a clinical psychologist doing research at the University of Oxford on misophonia. And we're going to dive into what misophonia is, what her own experience is with the phenomenon, and of course, her brand new book, which is available right now, called Sounds Like Misophonia: How to Stop Small Noises from Causing Extreme Reactions. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Jane Gregory. Jane, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me today.
I am excited to talk about your new book, Sounds Like Misophonia: How to Stop Small Noises from Causing Extreme Reactions. And you, of course, are somebody who, I mean, as a psychologist who studies misophonia, you know it inside and out from the sort of technical side, but you also have a very kind of subjective and personal experience with this phenomenon. So let's just get into it. Let's just start right at the top with like the definition of this word, because I think a lot of people know exactly what we're talking about, but they didn't know that this is what it's called.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's one of the things that every time I talk about this, somebody in the room says, "Oh my goodness, that's exactly what I have," or "That's why my dad made us eat crisps upstairs," or why my brother used to shout at me at the dinner table. So I think a lot of people either can relate to the experience or can recognize somebody in their life who maybe experiences it.
Right. So tell us about like maybe the technical or the clinical definition, because this is not listed in the DSM, right? But it's clearly an understood and established phenomenon.
I'm not sure if we would go so far as to say understood and established quite yet.
It's something we've heard of.
Yeah, well, it's something that you and I have heard of and some people have heard of, but there are still a lot of people who show up at their healthcare provider and are told, "I don't think that's a thing," or "I've never heard of that," or "That sounds like it's just part of your anxiety." So actually, there are still a lot of people who haven't heard of it. And just 2 years ago, we did a survey in the UK asking, in a general population sample, how many people were familiar with the term. And only 14% of people had heard the term. And a similar study was done in the US. And I think it was even less. It was maybe 11% in the US. And I think it's a little bit more well known now because there's been a bit more media coverage recently. But it's still not very well known and not very well understood.
Oh, yeah, that really shows my bias. Wow.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, I just assume that everybody knows what it is. And I do a little bit of like nerdy comedy. And so I do these talks. And at the start, it was part of the performance, I always say, like, give us a cheer if you've heard of misophonia. And it's been so wonderful to see the proportion of the audience change in terms of as the awareness of misophonia increases. So last night, nearly everyone in the room had heard of misophonia, but just 2 years ago, it was just a handful of people. So it is getting more well known, but still not. Still not sort of common lexicon, if that's the right word.
Absolutely. Well, and speaking of lexicon, I'm curious, the term itself, misophonia, where does it come from? Like, what are the component parts of it from like an etymology perspective?
It was named by this husband and wife research team, the Jastreboffs, Margaret and Pavel Jastreboff, who they basically got a linguist to help them come up with a term for these people that they'd been seeing who had a really specific reaction to really specific sounds. And so they brought together a whole lot of sort of root parts of words and decided on miso, which is hatred, and phonia, which is sounds. So it like literally translates to hatred of sounds, but they have very clearly said since then that they didn't intend for it to be understood literally. They just wanted a catchy word, and apparently one of them just also really liked miso soup, and so that influenced their decision, which I think is absolutely adorable.
That's really funny.
And so like the name itself can cause problems because it often gets reported as misophonia, hatred of sounds, but actually a lot of people with misophonia love sounds, and the difference between how they feel when they're listening to other sounds and how they feel when they're listening to specific trigger sounds is so vast that that's part of the problem.
Well, you know, it sort of strikes me, I'm about to get a little bit meta, like really, really early on the show, but it sort of strikes me.
I'm up for meta.
As the way that I often conceptualize kind of most, I guess, psychological disorders, dysfunctions, pathologies. I hate all those terms because I'm very existential in my view, but like I think of even the things that we think of as the most clinically relevant, like or clinically difficult, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, you know, kind of these what we think of like severe mental illnesses. When you look at the symptoms, it's a spectrum. Everybody has had a hallucination at some point in their life. Everybody has experienced what it's like to struggle with confusion, or who has experienced some amount of sadness or some amount of anxiety. And there becomes a point where it's clinically relevant because it interferes in your life in a way that makes it difficult to complete your tasks or to, you know, find joy or whatever the case may be. And I don't see misophonia as any different. Most everyone I know can pinpoint some triggering sound for them, but for some people it's much more debilitating than others.
Absolutely. I think that's right. Like most people can relate to not liking a particular sound or having an extreme reaction to a particular sound or a disproportionate reaction compared to other equally annoying sounds. But it's interesting that you used like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder as like examples of a continuum, because those are two disorders that I think of as being much more categorical.
Yeah, the most extreme. That's why I like to pick them. Yeah, because I can even pinpoint, usually even with those, I can pinpoint some, I don't know, example that we can relate to.
Yeah, although like if you look at the diagnostic criteria for bipolar, like you literally have to have had a manic episode to meet the criteria, and most people haven't experienced a manic episode. And with misophonia, we're not sure yet. Like it's obviously on a continuum that people can relate to the experiences, but also when you sort of look at it in a statistical way, it kind of clusters in a way that suggests that there are distinct categories, and one is like a clinical category of misophonia and one is more of a subclinical category of misophonia. And so if we think of sort of at the more extreme end, if we were to, in a clinical setting, if we were looking to make a diagnosis for treatment purposes, we'd probably say disorder level misophonia, and that the way we would distinguish clinical from subclinical would be about the impact that it has. So as you were saying, the point where it stops people from living their lives, where it causes day-to-day distress and significantly impacts on their lives. And then we've got this much bigger category of subclinical misophonia, which I think of it more as a phenomenon than a disorder, which is the phenomenon that your brain just processes sounds a little bit differently and has trouble filtering out certain sounds, and maybe over-attaches meaning to sounds and then can't unattach that meaning to sounds.
Oh, interesting. So it's a little bit beyond, or I guess we should say there's a little bit more kind of a psychological phenomenon than just the classic. I think sometimes you hear people say, "Oh, it's like nails on a chalkboard." Like that's the go-to, right? It's like nails on a chalkboard. But it's deeper than that. It's not just a grating sound, because there are some, I think, objectively grating sounds to people, right?
Yes, absolutely. And
Yeah.
nails on a chalkboard is a really great example of what we call a rough sound. So the acoustic properties of that sound you can't ignore. And that's a feature of the sound. And there are some things in nature that you're not supposed to ignore. So there's nails on a chalkboard sort of sounds a bit like a screeching monkey that is designed to get your attention. Or the roar of a lion is designed not to be ignored. As a crying baby is designed not to be ignored, designed in nature terms. But then we also have human-made products that are also designed not to be ignored. So alarms, sirens, like notification sounds, they're meant to be attention grabbing, and some of them are meant to be that you don't get used to them. So you're not supposed to get used to the sound of a siren. So what happens with misophonia is that other sounds that most people, they might not like, but they wouldn't have an extreme reaction to them. It's like your brain treats that sound as if it's a siren, as if it's not supposed to be ignored, as if it's a sign of danger or harm in some way.
Yeah. So I'm going to self-diagnose for a second. This is so gross.
Go
I
ahead.
shouldn't be doing this. But so I have two.
Most people with misophonia are self-diagnosed because it's still relatively unknown.
Well, and it's funny because when I work with clients who are neurodivergent, it's not uncommon for there to be some kind of sensory things. And I remember working with a younger male patient and kind of discussing misophonia with him, and this concept of like the sounds that are really difficult, and you know, like, what do you do when you hear these things and how do you work around it? And so obviously, to normalize the experience, I told him about my own, and we were sort of like laughing about how we had some in common and some very different. But I have two very specific triggers. They are metal utensils in a metal pot. I cannot be in the room if somebody is stirring something in a metal pot with a metal spoon. It's so overwhelming to me that I have to leave the room. I don't vomit. I don't, but I get the whole hair stand up on the back of my neck and like that shudder stance. Like I can't help but shudder. And then the other is a rake on the sidewalk. Like when somebody's gardening outside and they drag that on the side. I cannot stand that sound.
And if you sort of look at the acoustic properties of those two sounds, it's really, really similar. There is like literally a grating kind of sound to both of those. And so when you hear those sounds, what do you experience?
So it's almost like I recoil a little. It doesn't make me nauseated. I don't feel ill. And I don't necessarily have a strong emotional reaction. Like it doesn't make me angry, but I recoil. So I find myself, I shudder and I have to cover my ears or get out of the room very quickly. I'm very, very aversive. Like I have a fight or flight I just have a flight response.
A flight.
just a flight response.
Just the flight. Yeah, so that urge to escape the sound, I think a lot of people with misophonia can relate to that experience, that feeling like you have to get away from the sound. And that's one of the things in some of the research that I do. So I collaborate with Celia Vitaratu, who's at King's College London. She's a statistician specializing in psychometrics, which is basically, for listeners, when you try to measure concepts that can't be directly observed. So you might measure symptoms of depression, for example, through questionnaires, and you use special statistical, very fancy maths to see how things cluster together to then be able to measure a concept that you can't directly observe. So we've worked together to create this questionnaire, and within that process, we discovered there are these 5 aspects of misophonia that kind of work together. And one of the key ones that you can use to sort of distinguish people with and without misophonia is this, what we call emotional threat, which is this feeling of feeling trapped or helpless, like you have to get away from the sound, like something horrible would happen if you didn't get away from the sound.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I am relatively high functioning and I have a lot of coping skills and adaptive behaviors, but if I cannot escape because it would not be socially acceptable or, for whatever reason, it doesn't seem like a viable option, I'll plug my ears. If I can't plug my ears, I have learned to do this. It's almost like the Valsalva maneuver where you sort of bear down and it causes white noise in your head. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about, but I can't do it. So people describe it to me, but I can't create that sound in my ears.
Interesting. So I'm glad that you've had other, I'm glad you've had other research subjects or people you've talked to who are like, oh yeah, I basically drown it out inside my own head.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, and I think the other part of what you were saying there about like if it's not socially acceptable to get away, I think that's also part of this trapped feeling. And sometimes it's right now in the moment, it wouldn't be socially acceptable, but sometimes it's that those sounds are sort of connecting back to experiences from childhood where you couldn't leave the situation. And so you still feel trapped, but it's because it's tapping into these memories of like sitting at the family dinner table where you would be told off if you left the table. You'd be told off if you got angry at someone. So you had to suppress your feelings. You had to stay in the situation. You were literally trapped there. And so then when you hear those same sounds as an adult, it takes you back without, not consciously, you don't realize that it's going back to these specific memories, but sometimes those early experiences from childhood are shaping what you feel in the moment because that's what you experienced when you were younger.
Oh, it's fascinating. Is that sort of the dominant, I guess we could say, theory as to why misophonia exists? Or do we think that I'm sure it's biopsychosocial and it's, nature, nurture, and all the things mixed together. But I'm curious, what are some of those kind of those explanatory theories of why people develop it, other than maybe linking to an early childhood experience that felt quite noxious or dangerous?
There are quite a few theories. We really don't have enough research yet to be able to really strongly connect with one particular theory. We know from studies of the brain that there's something different happening. There are different connections happening in the brain in people with misophonia compared to people without misophonia when they hear these certain sounds. And those differences are only there for these specific kinds of sounds, these like eating and breathing sounds, and not for generally averse sounds. So if it was just something that everyone finds averse, the brain patterns aren't different. But when you listen to that kind of trigger sound, then there's a different process happening in the brain, and there's sort of some hyperconnectivity between auditory processing, emotion processing, fight and flight, like amygdala kind of part of the brain. There's one theory that it's also connected to the motor area of the brain, which one theory is that that's related to sort of an unconscious mimicking process, like you're almost like your body's trying to copy what the other person is doing. So your jaw starts to tense up because it's activating part of your jaw, and that the theory is that that's one of the reasons why it feels so intrusive, because it's actually activating something in your body. And that's just a theory at this stage. But as you can see, there's quite a wide range.
Yeah, lots of ideas that I guess either are actively being tested, or people are trying to figure out how to test these kinds of hypotheses, and some of them may never be testable. But it's, I'm curious, is there sort of the opposite end of the spectrum? Like, I was just thinking how nails on a chalkboard is a sort of universal phenomenon that, like, most people agree that's not a pleasant, or if somebody's, eating, we've all had this experience, you're at the dinner table and somebody squeaks their knife across their plate, and it's very similar to nails on a chalkboard, and the whole table's like, and it makes me wonder, are there people who are just like completely immune to it? Like, I think about like the Alex Honnold's, right? The famous rock climber whose amygdala is like very quiet. And they just like, so they hear something, they're like, whatever, doesn't bother me.
Yeah. So I'm sure that there are people at that end where the reactivity in the brain is just not that strong. And I'm sure it's all on a spectrum. And if we think about that idea of it not just being this sort of emotional reaction to sound, but also the meaning placed on the sound. So what you what you believe the sound is, who is making the sound, what context they're making it in. So the exact same sound, like literally the same audio, can cause a different reaction if the person thinks it's somebody eating with their mouth open compared to if they think that it's like a puppy, adorable puppy eating its food. And so, like, and I've got a friend who didn't believe this idea that there was anything other than just the reactions. There's like, because I was trying to say, like, no, this is like, it's not interpretation's the wrong word, but it's like there's another process that's going on there about what the sound means. And she one day like just felt this instant surge of anger because she heard her husband eating really loudly, whipped her head around, and it was her baby eating, and the reaction disappeared. And she came to me with like a tail between her legs, just going, okay, I believe you now.
You see it. It's funny. It's like, I feel like it's become a social media phenomenon where the same disgust reaction that we might have, like you said, to watching a movie where somebody's eating and talking with their mouth open, but on, let's say, Instagram or TikTok, it's like a puppy eating and they call it ASMR. And people are like, this is so calming and relaxing. And you're like, wow, because it's the same sound.
Absolutely. And they've done it with different sensory stuff as well. So someone was telling me the other day about a study where they gave people a smell, and one group they told them it was dirty socks, and the other one they told them that it was blue cheese, and their reaction was completely different to that smell depending on what they were told was creating that smell. And even nails on a chalkboard, I think there's been research in that as well, where they presented the sound, and I can't remember what the alternative explanation was for the sound, but it did have a less intense reaction when you believed that it was something else creating the sound. So there is an interpretation process happening. And there was a really great study at Concordia University. Maria Nikseva did a study where they masked the sound and then slowly uncovered the sound from another sound to test whether people with high and low misophonia would detect the sound at different times, because the theory was that people with misophonia will hear the sound sooner, and actually they didn't. It was exactly the same. And when people with misophonia had the more intense reaction to the sound compared to people without misophonia, it was only once they'd identified what the sound was. So it wasn't just the acoustic properties of the sound. It was, I know what that is and I don't like it. And that's when the reaction starts.
To me, it's just like is just another sort of tick mark in the column for constructivism. Just this idea that, like, yes, there is objective reality, but we cannot observe it without our lens, and our lens adds so much meaning to everything. All of the experiences we had, all of our neurological functioning, like, whether it's something really we think of as pure, like the flavor of a food or the smell of a molecule, or the literal compression of sound waves and our tiny little, cells in our ears, the little hairs being affected by them, we put meaning and interpretation on that in a major way.
Absolutely. And I think it sort of gets a bit lost because, especially, like, I work from a CBT perspective, and often CBT gets talked about as like your interpretation, as if it's this kind of conscious verbal thought going through your head, like, oh, I
like
know
a
what
choice
that is.
you're
and
making.
And actually what I'm interested in is like what it feels like in your body and how you interpret what it feels like in your body. So if you feel disgusted by it, then you might think, oh, that's a disgusting thing to do because I feel disgusted. So you sort of like the internal sensations and the emotions kind of come first, and then the thought part is actually just a way that you put language to the experience that you're having in your body. And those experiences that you have in your body are entirely shaped by your past experiences, your perception of the world, what you think of other people, what you think of the specific person making the sound. Some people will be bothered only by one person in their life, and any sound that they make drives them mad. But when it comes to somebody else, it's no problem.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because, I mentioned before, my perspective is deeply existential. I use CBT approaches all the time, as I think most clinicians do, but I don't really conceptualize through a CBT lens. But for anybody listening who's like gobbledygook, that's fine. Just fast forward. But for those who are like really deeply interested in this, the funny thing is, I find that it's a lot of like different labels for the exact same thing in psychology. And for me, yeah, I see that as just meaning making. What we do in our life is we're just constantly trying to make meaning out of data inputs. And we have all of these data inputs, and then we have to make meaning from them. And I'm super curious, though. You mentioned something before about chewing, and I wanted to make sure that I brought this up because sometimes when you look up even just the definition of misophonia, people explicitly list it as like an aversive reaction to chewing sounds. Why has it gotten that weird bias? Like misophonia equals I don't like chewing sounds, because it can be any sound, right?
It can be any sound. Like it can be, it's sort of like your brain can attach these reactions, this sort of meaning to any sound, given the right circumstances. But overwhelmingly, chewing is the most frequently reported. And again, in that general population study and misophonia sample, like the chewing, the reaction, if someone endorsed being triggered by chewing, you could predict their misophonia severity from it. There's like some complicated statistics there that I don't massively understand, but it was one of the best sounds to use to determine whether someone was likely to have misophonia or not. So it's not, you can have misophonia without having an aversion to chewing, but it is overwhelmingly one of the most common and one of the most intense reactions. And it's more likely to cause like an anger or panic response, whereas some of the other trigger sounds might be more of an irritation or disgust kind of response. So the nature of the reaction to chewing can be different as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. So I'm curious, we talked a little bit about sort of the categorical versus dimensional aspects and what a spectrum looks like. When you're working specifically, maybe not so much in a research capacity, but in a clinical capacity, when you're actually interested in helping people who have misophonia to the extent that it is, impacting their lives negatively, what do you notice, or what are some of the common endorsements? Like, what's the experience like for individuals for whom they go to a psychologist for help?
I think there are a few things. So that that sort of variable factor that I described before, that emotional threat factor, that's sort of the key one that keeps coming up. This sense of feeling trapped, feeling helpless, feeling like you might panic or explode when you're around these sounds. So there's sort of a nicely descriptive way of responding to sounds. And so therefore sometimes it's just that someone has that really strong and it starts to get in the way of their life, or they have sounds around them that cause that reaction so frequently that they can't get on with living their life. So it might be they live below somebody with very heavy feet who stomps all day. And so they're constantly having that trigger response. And another aspect of it is, again, not just the meaning of the sound itself, but the meaning of your reaction. So feeling bad about yourself, feeling ashamed or embarrassed by your reactions, being afraid of what you might do, afraid you might snap and hurt somebody or say something that you regret, being afraid of being judged by other people if they know that you're reacting this way. Or the alternative is feeling really strong feelings towards the person making the sound. So feeling like if you're making the sound, that means you don't care about me or that you want to harm me. So sort of there's, in some cases, a sort of distorted perception. Sort of it feels like that, but you know that it's not. And in other cases, that is exactly what's happening. So sometimes people in the workplace, for example, say, oh, well, once I told them that I get a strong reaction to this sound, they started making the sound deliberately around me. And then it becomes a bullying problem that is showing up through misophonia. But there is also this very real problem around that in the workplace. So, I mean, I have just gone off on a bit of a tangent.
No, it's fascinating because it shows all the different aspects, right? It shows like the professional, the personal, the relational, like all of the different, like we think of this, right? When we think about diagnostics, it's like, is it affecting somebody in school or work? Is it affecting them in their romantic relationships, in their family, in their social set? And it seems like for a lot of people who really struggle with misophonia, like every interaction with another human being is very loaded and it can get really complicated really fast.
Yeah, and their life can just get smaller and smaller because avoidance is one of the easiest things to do to make the reaction go away. Then you stop doing things that you would like to be doing because of the sounds that you might come across there. So the point that people usually come for help is because it's affecting school or work or relationships, or it's limiting their life in some way.
And you see this kind of, or at least I'm noticing a parallel here with obsessive compulsive disorder, where even though it's very different in terms of the disorder, right, that we're not talking about a link between these sort of obsessive thought patterns and these behaviors. But what often happens, especially with obsessive compulsive, with agoraphobia, is that people's lives get smaller, is they start avoiding certain situations. And sometimes it gets so bad that they can't leave their homes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in terms of how we help people with misophonia, is looking at those similarities with other conditions. And obsessive compulsive disorder is a really good example, because one of the things that can happen for people with misophonia is that they get these violent thoughts and images about the person making the sound, and can have a reaction similar to what somebody with OCD has when they have an intrusion, where they feel like, this makes me a terrible person, or what if I act on this? What if I can't control myself one day? What's wrong with me that I'm thinking and feeling this way? And so when you're working with somebody, if you can find those similarities with other conditions, you can use some of the strategies that we already know work for those particular aspects of the condition.
You know, it's so fascinating because I've been kind of thinking in my head this whole time. And again, this is going to be a little bit sort of wonky, but you know, I've had, gosh, I don't even know what episode number I'm on right now with Talk Nerdy, but we've been on air for almost 10 years. So I'm actually going to scroll to my spreadsheet right now to see. So I think your episode is episode 480. So obviously I've talked about a lot of different things on the show over the years. And I remember speaking with Lulu Miller about her book, Why Fish Don't Exist, which of course was a biography, but it was also a real grappling with categories and with the human need to put things into categories and to say this is related to this but not related to that. And I'm fascinated by this concept as well, because on the one hand, I can say it's so meaningful and so helpful for us to organize the world. And on the other hand, you can almost say it's completely arbitrary and doesn't matter. But I'm so curious from your perspective, and obviously if this is I guess if this is a professional question that you're like, I cannot answer, don't worry about it. But if you were to redesign a DSM, like where would you put this disorder? Would you put it with anxiety disorders? Would you put it like closer to kind of an OCD, which, you know, used to be thought of as anxiety, but now some people argue that it's not? Like, would you put it as a sensory integration disorder, or like maybe on the autism spectrum? Like, where would you stick this?
It's a great question. And firstly, I think I would be reorganizing some of those categories anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But the closest, I think, would probably be neurodevelopmental conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so this
along
idea
with,
that along with autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that there's probably, and especially because there's some real consistency in the age of onset. So a lot of people say that it develops around the age of 8 or 9, or maybe around 11 or 12. There's sort of these 2 points where lots of people say it develops around that time, and some people it's a bit earlier, and some people it's just later in life after a certain event. So there is examples of sort of transient experiences of misophonia.
Oh, right. Almost like a PTSD reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So like it could be after an ear infection, suddenly your brain is tuning into these sounds and you're like, why am I suddenly not able to ignore these sounds? And then get really frustrated, and then it sort of builds into more like a misophonia reaction. But for most people, they can relate to, as a kid, having a sensitivity to these particular sounds, finding it hard to tune them out. And at some point, it may be developed into more of a problem. And sometimes that's around a specific transition or event in their life or conflict or something that was sort of unsettling. It might grow. But I think that there is probably for most people this key element that won't change. And so you sort of just have to learn how to live with the fact that your brain processes sounds a little bit differently. But I do think there are lots of layers to the problem that I can relate more to anxiety disorders, OCD, where the meaning gets placed on the reaction, and that's something that we can change. And if your brain is treating these sounds as harmful or threatening in some way, then there are things that we can do to make it so that those sounds feel no more harmful than any other annoying sound. And so that part of it, I think, can change, but I think you'll still be left with this part that just doesn't tune out these sounds.
So, I'm curious when somebody comes to you for help. I mean, obviously, therapy is never one size fits all, and it really depends on the individual experience. But are you finding that things like exposure and response prevention, things like maybe even ACT, like acceptance and commitment therapy, or maybe aspects of DBT, like what kinds of approaches are you usually taking?
Well, because everyone does have a really different experience at the moment. What we do is use a lot of transdiagnostic techniques. So we look at, well, what's the sort of cycle for this particular person that we can see is happening. So if they happen to spend a lot of time ruminating between the sounds, then we'll use a intervention for rumination. If they're feeling hopeless and like their future's going to be miserable because of misophonia, then we might use some depression type interventions. If they're feeling like they're going to get so angry that something terrible would happen, like a stroke or a heart attack or something, then we'll use some ideas from panic and sort of interoceptive exposure type things. So we'll sort of look at what's going on and choose things that we know work for those particular mechanisms and work on kind of the layers around the misophonia. So if one of the things that we do pretty frequently in our clinic here in Oxford is looking at those childhood experiences. So it's this technique called emotion bridging, where you bring a recent example to the surface of a strong reaction to the sound, get all the emotions back to the surface, and then you sort of float back to what does this remind you of? When's the first time you remember feeling this way? Any early childhood memories that your mind takes you back to when you're feeling this? And almost always, adults with misophonia, it does take them back to a specific memory. And so then we do memory rescripting, imagery rescripting, which comes from trauma-focused therapy, and help to, and that's also part of schema therapy, where it's basically you sort of work out what was missing at the time. That means that this memory's kind of become frozen in time, and you update it with what you needed at the time. So you meet the needs of that child. So if what they needed was somebody to say, yeah, exactly. So it could be you didn't know what misophonia was, and so you thought you were going crazy. And so we sort of talk to the child and say, it's okay, there's this thing called misophonia, you're not crazy. The people at the table don't understand why you're so upset, but that's because they don't know about misophonia either. And so if we can do that for that sort of child within you, then when you're reacting in the current moment, it gets less influenced by those early experiences that tell you that you're in danger or that you're being harmed, when you know that's not really what's happening. So that's another sort of key technique that we use with most adults with misophonia. And then the only thing that's really misophonia specific are the sounds-based exercises that we do. And that's where it's based on that idea that the brain has made a connection between this sound and some kind of harm or threat or danger. And what we want to do is break that connection. And
right. So in that way, it's really similar to OCD, like exposure and response prevention.
It is, but it's not like with OCD. I know we don't really do the sort of like graded exposure thing very often in the UK anymore,
okay.
But we would do more like behavioral experiments. So where you test out, well, what do you predict will happen? And so one experiment might be if you stay in the presence of like if you stay in the room with the toilet or you touch the toilet and don't wash your hands, like what do you predict will happen? And then we test whether that prediction is true, but we don't make people just sort of sit there and wait for the anxiety to come down.
Right.
But we also know that that doesn't really work very well for misophonia, because actually the opposite can happen and they can become more sensitized to the sound. So if they just have to sit there and listen to the sound, unless you're testing a specific belief about what will happen, for a lot of people, they will actually just get more and more upset, more angry, more disgusted. So unless there's a very specific clinical reason that the patient agrees with to do any kind of graded exposure, we don't recommend it. So what we do instead is we try and create new experiences with sound, because what we're trying to do is teach the brain that this sound is no more harmful than any other annoying sound. So if the theory is that you feel like it's harmful because of your previous experiences with that sound, then we create new experiences that don't feel harmful or dangerous. And that might be doing something silly with the sound. It might just be being in control of the sound. So having a recording and turning the volume up, speeding it up, slowing it down, listening to it in different ways, making a piece of music out of the sound, but just doing different things with that sound so that the brain gets an opportunity to experience that sound in a situation where you're in complete control and where it's not harmful or dangerous in any way.
It's so funny because I think about like that specific approach and how almost, I don't want to use the word natural because it's so loaded, but how almost, I'm going to use it anyway, natural it is that so many people do it anyway. Like they already cope that people with, I think, like higher coping mechanisms already, like let's say there's a grating or frustrating or disgusting sound, they might sing a song over top of it, or they might utilize that sound and turn it into something else in order to cope in that moment.
Yeah. And if we sort of distinguish between the people who come looking for help and the people who are coping just fine with misophonia, that's one of the differences, is that the instinctive strategies can be helpful and therefore it's not that big of a problem. So in the same way,
so they may need to learn those strategies.
Yeah, and we often learn them naturally, but just in the same way that somebody with panic disorder who has panic attacks, like someone else might one day have a racing heart and go, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. And then they'll go, no, you know what? It's probably just because I had an extra strong coffee and I'm running for the bus. That's probably why my heart's racing. So that's a really natural process to do as well, is to kind of update the experience with new information that is a better theory for what's going on. And the problem is that people with panic attacks often can't do that. For any number of reasons.
Even if they know that, even if they know that, it's sometimes not enough for them to not feel those sensations.
Yeah, and they don't have access to it in the moment that they're panicking, and therefore even if they know outside of the moment that a panic attack is just a panic attack, they're not believing it in the moment. In the moment, it feels like they're dying. And so they're going to react as if they are dying, just in case, because what if they are?
Right.
And so in the same way that with panic, what we would do is we'd say, okay, well, let's create a controlled environment. You're in charge. Let's get your heart rate up and see what happens. Let's see if when your heart beats fast, does it explode? Do you have a heart attack? Or is it just that feels scary and actually is a really normal bodily sensation? And so we're doing the same thing with sounds. It's like maybe this sound, it might be gross, it might be annoying, but it's not harming you. It just feels like it is.
So I'm curious maybe to kind of transition a little bit to some news you can use. You know, I like to do that on the show for those who are listening. Obviously, if somebody's listening to the show, they're really identifying with this. They're finally able to put a label on an experience they've had their whole lives and starting to realize maybe I should talk to somebody. Obviously, that's the advice we would give. Talk to somebody, try and seek out a therapist who can help you with that. But if there's somebody who's listening who has been utilizing some of their own coping mechanisms, or kind of like you talked about, they're experiencing some of that subclinical misophonia, what are some recommendations that you might make that individuals could practice or could work towards to try and lessen the impact a little bit or soften the blow a little bit? Like the next time I hear a rake on a sidewalk, what do you recommend I do?
Well, I think the first thing is having the information that you need. So having a word for what you're experiencing, knowing that you're not the only person experiencing it, knowing that you're not crazy. Like I spent most of my life thinking I was really uptight and controlling because of the way that I reacted to sounds, even though I wasn't that way. I mean, I'm a little bit uptight normally, but anyway, but it wasn't like I was sort of chronically uptight or controlling in any other aspect of my life. But because I was when it came to sounds, it made me feel like that was part of my personality. So I think that's the first part, is just reminding yourself that you're not a terrible person. You just process sounds differently. And I think that alone can be really helpful for a lot of people. But one of the reasons I wrote the book is because there are lots of different things that you can do to be sort of curious about your reactions to sounds that can then change the way your brain relates to those sounds. And so that's the thing that I would recommend, is be really curious about sound. So it might just be like, listen to the sound and label all of the different physical or acoustic properties that you can hear in the sound. Label all the feelings that you experience in your body when you're listening to the sound. Think about what else it could be that could make a similar sound. So a sniffing sound can sound like a broom pushing on a footpath. A slurping of tea can sound like a drain emptying out, or like a sniffing sound can also sound like a slurping sound can also sound like Velcro ripping or a zip opening. So just sort of think about, what else could be making this sound? And that way you're interacting with sounds in a neutral or non-harmful way. And your brain over time, with repetition, will actually start to learn, okay, it might still be annoying, but it's not harmful. And in terms of your question about what you do about the break, that's the other thing, is also that if you get this really intense reaction to sounds and you are curious and you experiment with it and you still get the same reaction, then just use earplugs. Just put headphones on, just leave the room. That's okay too. It doesn't make you a bad person or too sensitive or any of that. Like, it's okay to need strategies to help you focus, to help you relax, to get away from things that feel uncomfortable. Like, it's okay to want to make yourself more comfortable.
Yeah. And, I would add to that, even like what I try to do is just normalize it. So if I am in a group, obviously, if I'm in a business meeting and there's a rake on the sidewalk outside, it may not be socially acceptable for me to get up and get out of the room, but maybe I can excuse myself to go to the bathroom or something like that. But if I'm with friends or with people I trust and I feel safe with, I will literally put my fingers in my ears and be like, I cannot stand this sound. I have to go, And it's funny because a lot of other people are like, oh, I have things like that too. And it does normalize the experience.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that I sort of want people to preserve as part of the experience of therapy or of reading the book, is you are allowed to have an opinion about a sound. The problem isn't that you have the opinion about the sound. You're allowed to think it's disgusting. You're allowed to think that people shouldn't eat with their mouth open. Like, all of that is okay. And it doesn't make you a terrible person, because that's just individual difference. It's just about, let's not let this stop you from being able to do things with people that you care about. Let's not let this stop you from being able to work and concentrate, and just use the strategies that you need to be able to do those things. And that's okay. And I don't think it's the same as, we're comparing it to OCD before. And what we know with OCD through lots of experimental research is that the behavior, the compulsion part of OCD reinforces the distress. So the more you do the behavior, the more it fuels the OCD. And I'm not convinced that that's the case for misophonia. I think that there are a lot of people who just use really helpful coping strategies that enable them to participate in life. And it doesn't necessarily make the problem worse. And there may be examples where people are doing things that are sort of causing problems in relationships, and they might want to tweak those things. So I also encourage people to be curious about their strategies and test them out and experiment with different ones so that they feel like they're picking the best ones for them. But there's no good evidence at this stage from the research that says we shouldn't be putting in earplugs when we want to concentrate, that we shouldn't be leaving the room if we need a little break from the sound. There's nothing that tells us from research that that's a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so helpful. I usually at this point in the show, I'm closing up and I'm realizing that usually in the show, I also open with obviously the researcher or the writer's experience of their own, like, how'd you get into this? What? And I just kind of blew past the fact I mentioned that you had your own subjective experience of this, but I would love to maybe just take a few minutes for you to share with us, if you're comfortable, like your own experience with misophonia and how it affected, obviously, your interest in the work.
Yeah, I think it very heavily affected my interest in the work. Like I definitely wouldn't be doing this work if it wasn't for my own experience with misophonia. And I dedicated the book to myself as a teenager. This is basically when I was sitting there writing the book, I was like, what do I wish I'd known when I was 15 years old? And I used to have to sit in the classroom I had like a big clunky old Walkman in my pocket, and I would feed the headphones up through my school uniform and hide the earbuds under my hair so that I could have music playing so that I wouldn't get distracted by clicking pens and people talking and rustling and making sounds in the classroom. So I had these strategies and I felt really, really alone in those strategies. And I was literally like shutting the world out with those strategies. And it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I discovered the term misophonia. It was such a relief. I was like, oh my goodness, like everything makes sense just knowing that that is a phenomenon that exists. And I'm not crazy. And even that idea that it might mean there's something I could do about it as well. And because I was a clinical psychologist and I knew lots of sort of strategies from working with other conditions, I started to experiment on myself. And that's, again, where this all started, was I just tried stuff out on myself and it helped. And so then I started thinking, okay, well, maybe we should be helping other people.
hmm Yeah, and did you like find in your movement towards kind of training and becoming expert in this area, did you find other professionals, like other psychologists, other researchers who sort of found a similar path? Like, yeah, I got into this because I totally have to deal with this too.
Well, all of I was already a clinical psychologist when I discovered what misophonia was. And so it wasn't like a driving force to becoming a therapist or anything. But I'm now doing a second doctorate basically because I'm retraining in research so that I can get back into research so that I can understand this better and really test those mechanisms that could be influencing someone's experience of misophonia and what might work in terms of treatment. And so that pivot back to research I only did that because I wanted to know more about misophonia.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like I've seen something really similar with psychologists and neuroscientists who themselves have synesthesia and then ultimately ended up studying synesthesia. And I wonder if there is like some similar crossover there as well. But it's just absolutely fascinating. I think that I was really excited when your book came across my desk and the opportunity to interview you came up because it is such to me, interesting. I think I might call what I deal with misophonia light. Like I definitely can identify with the phenomenon, but I do see it more as a phenomenon for me and less of like a clinically kind of relevant thing that I have to, that really it impacts my life in a negative way. But I was just so hopeful that individuals listening to the show might identify with this. And even if they personally don't struggle with it, they might know somebody who does, and that this would raise a little bit of awareness about that. It's fascinating, but it really does come home. So I'm super grateful for the work that you do and for the fact that you wrote this book for a general audience to be able to read about it, educate themselves, and hopefully normalize their experiences a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And when the book first came out, one of the sort of things that I noticed on Amazon was that it was one of the most gifted books. So basically,
Yeah.
it's like people were just like subtly sending it to anyone who'd ever glared at them for eating like tortilla chips or something.
I love that.
I like the idea that it was just like showing up on people's doorsteps.
Like, who sent this to me? Oh, well, I guess it does apply. Oh my gosh, that's so funny. Well, gosh, everybody, the book is Sounds Like Misophonia, How to Stop Small Noises from Causing Extreme Reactions by Dr. Jane Gregory. Jane, thank you so much for spending time with us today, for educating us, for entertaining us, and for helping us dig a little bit deeper into this like pretty common phenomenon.
Well, thank you for being interested in this common phenomenon that somehow people still don't know about. And yeah, for inviting me on to talk about it.
Absolutely. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.